Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord. And the Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement, that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. The king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, Armori and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merib, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Meholathite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites. And they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord, and the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of barley harvest. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of harvest until rain fell upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. When David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hanged them, on the day the Philistines killed Saul in Gilboa. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. And they buried the sons of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin in Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. And they did all that the king commanded. And after that, God responded to the plea for the land.
I would suspect you're a bit confused and concerned with the passage today. When you read it this week, you saw what appeared to be happening. You go, I don't get how that can end that way. Because it starts with David seeking the Lord. The Lord tells him it's because of the Gibeonites. Then he gets these Gibeonites to tell him what the problem is in their view. And it ends after these 7 men have been hanged. It says God responds to the plea of the land. So it starts with there's a problem and it ends with the solution. And it looks like all is okay. And we go, I don't understand how it could have ended that way. This confronts everything I think is probably right. Right? I mean, there's a lot here that's very difficult for us. Well, we're going to try to tackle it, see is this something God approved of or is something else going on here. So here's my plan. I want to first try to understand the problem and why it brought about the famine. Then I want to see how David fits into fixing this problem and why he's the only one to fix the problem. And then looking at how it does point us to Jesus. So, first problem. What's the problem here? Verse 1. And there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of the Lord. The Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. And we don't know for certain when this famine occurred. It just says it's in the days of David. All the scholars who write about 1st and 2nd Samuel say Samuel 21 through 24 is kind of a separate thing at the end that's helping us interpret what happened earlier. It's not all in chronological order. So we really don't know exactly when this happened. We just know it happened during the days of David, and it must have happened after David brought Mephibosheth into his house. So for certain it's happening after chapter 9, but we don't know when. And it's a 3-year famine, and it's very clear. It's year after year. It has everybody's attention like it would in our day, and David takes it seriously. And he knows there's not a disunity between what's happening in the land and morality. He thinks something's going on, so he's seeking the Lord's will. What is going on here? Why would he want to know if there is something else going on? And it's not just a meteorological thing. It's because the law of Moses, which they are under, has told them, if God is displeased with you, if you are breaking the covenant, he is going to send all sorts of horrible things to get your attention. And one of those things is a famine. And so it's right for David to start to think, is there a connection here? And so he seeks the Lord. Is it something that I or the people have done that have caused this? And I don't know if it took 3 years for David to catch on, or if he's been seeking the Lord for 3 years and God finally answers. We don't know. We just don't know. The text says he sought the Lord. And it's going to say God answered him, so I'm taking this as David was right to seek the Lord, and the Lord does answer him at some point. And he says, God says, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. So what's so bad about putting the Gibeonites to death? We know that this is not part of the people of Israel. It's not one of the tribes. They are the foreigners who were in the land when Joshua came in to take the land. So what's so bad about that? Well, if you've read the book of Joshua, you know that about 400 years before this with David is happening, Joshua's coming. He's conquered Jericho. They've gone up to Ai. They've conquered that. And there's this group of dusty, well-worn travelers that come and say, make a covenant with us. And Joshua and the elders make a covenant. And if you've read the story, you know that these are not people from a distant land. They're just a couple miles away. And they are deceiving the people of Israel because they're afraid and they want God to make a covenant with this people so that they will not be destroyed. So, what you need to know from that story is there was a deception there, but still the Israelites are compelled and under oath to keep their end of the deal, even though they were deceived. And so even in the latter chapters of Joshua, actually just a couple chapters later, when the Gibeonites are under attack, the Israelites go and defend them. And now you need to know that for 400 years, they were still in covenant with them. They were under the protection as a vassal state or a vassal town, vassal people, and the Israelites were obligated to protect them. But what happened? Saul, in his zeal for the people of Israel, goes and he tries to destroy them. We don't know when this happened. It's not recorded anywhere else except here. But it makes maybe a little sense what Saul's doing, because here's Jerusalem. If you know where that's at, kind of by down southern part of Israel. Here's Jerusalem. Just 4 miles north is Gibeah of Saul. That's Saul's hometown, where Saul's capital is. Just 4 miles north. The Gibeonites are like 2 miles away from there. Can you hear the similarities between Gibeah of Saul and the Gibeonites? Can you hear the similarities? They're neighbors. And so maybe it's a little bit understandable that Saul would think, I'm the king, and we've got foreigners living on my doorstep. I should get rid of the problem. Maybe it makes sense, but it was incredibly wrong of Saul to do this because they were under oath to protect the Gibeonites. So that's the whole background to this story. And God tells David that there's blood guilt on Saul and his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. Now, my ESV, the one that we read this morning, says it like that. There's blood guilt on Saul and on his house. That's good, but it maybe obscures one little thing. Literally, so some of you might have like a King James version, and it says it's because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house. So instead of saying there's blood guilt, it says there's a bloodthirsty house. And it's literally, so if you read like the literal standard version, it says it is because of Saul and his house of blood. or his bloody house. Now, the ESV has interpreted that to mean there's guilt, and that's true. But it's Saul and his house of blood, or literally just Saul and a bloody house. Saul and the bloody house. If you're called a bloody house, you know that's not a positive term. It is meaning something has happened. What has his bloody house done? It's killed those they were supposed to protect. What is important to note there is that it's not just Saul that's going about and killing these people. It's not that Saul has done it himself, and it's not that Saul has said to the people of Israel, Israel, I'm your king now, we need to obliterate this Gibeonite threat of ours. No, it's he and his house. So it's not him doing it alone. It's a tribal thing. It's a clan thing. They together are seeking to eliminate the threat that's at their town. Okay? But now, Saul and his sons are dead. They've been judged for their sins. And yet, sometime later, there is now a famine coming upon the land, and God says it's because this issue is unresolved. So Saul is dead, his sons are dead, and yet the issue still remains. Hasn't it been dealt with? Hasn't he been taken out of power? Yes, but the issue still remains. I think that's an important thing to note here. So, Saul is now dead, and yet the problem still remains. Whose problem is it now? David's. He's the king. He has to come up with the solution. That's why it's been revealed to the king. So, my next question is not only what's the problem here, but why is David the one to fix this problem? So, I want you to hold off in your mind just for a little bit longer about these 7 men being hanged in death. First, let's focus on David and how he's the solution here. So I'm going to read verses 2 through 6. I'm going to emphasize David taking the initiative here. David doing things. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnants of the Amorites. They're a foreign people. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, that's the story we just talked about, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement, that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" The Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he, David, said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" They said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we should have no place at all in the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." So I want you to see there that David is taking responsibility here for this. He is the king. He now has the responsibility of dealing with famine, and so he has to bring this about. Now, we can speculate all we want. Did David ask the Lord beforehand, "Okay, Lord, it's the famine. What do I do?" Was David then told, "You need to talk to the Gibeonites"? Was God silent? We don't know. All we're told is that God does tell him clearly it's because of the Gibeonites. They have been the one wronged, and because the solution is right, apparently, it seems right that David would then call the Gibeonites. What do I need to do? How do I make atonement? That's very interesting, because in our mind, or at least in my mind, I think if I had been King David and I had been told it's because of the Gibeonites, because they were wrongfully killed, I'd think, well, it looks like it's the problem of Saul's house. I'm going to go talk to whoever is left in Saul's house and have them deal with this problem. But that's not what happens. He is in charge now. He's got to do something. So it's important to see now how David asks the question. He says in verse 3, "How shall I make atonement?" Now that's not a usual word to use in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's only been used twice. One at the beginning of 1 Samuel, where God says to the house of Eli, there is no way to make atonement for this house. And now here at the end, David says, what do I need to make atonement for what's happened here? Well, I got to ask the question, what's atonement? So at base, atonement is a word that talks about how do you bring a resolved conflict between two parties. There's a guilty party and a party that's done the wrong and has been wronged. How do you resolve what's gone on there? That's what atonement does. It's a resolution term. And it can have the idea of a ransom. There's a problem, we got to ransom it. Or an idea of a substitute. Or at base, this is probably the most important part of the term, it has something to do with like eliminating the problem. So the idea is one of like cleansing or covering over, resolving. So atonement is a resolution term. What do I need to do to resolve this? And it always comes up in sacrificial contexts, dealing with a sacrifice of some sort. So here's David who says, I need to deal with it. What do I need to make this right? What kind of, it's a sacrifice language. What kind of sacrifice is needed? What kind of ransom is needed? What kind of substitute? And the sin of Saul's house was to destroy the Gibeonites. So David is now going to resolve this. And what will be the result? If David can figure out how to bring atonement or bring about this resolution, God will answer the plea of the land so there's no more famine. So here's David looking for the solution. He calls the Gibeonites. He asks them what to do. I think it's right that he's talking to the Gibeonites because they were the wronged ones. And here's what they say. It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house. Neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel. And so you read it and you think, well, do they not know what they want? Is this a new thought to them? It's pretty strategic what they've said. They have eliminated two possibilities. Now, before we answer why they then asked for 7 sons, I'm going to read something of the law. So remember, they're under the law. Under the law, they were supposed to hold up to this covenant with the Gibeonites. And now I'm going to go back to the law. This is Numbers 35, verse 30. This is what the law says. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. Moreover, you shall accept no ransom. That's our word atonement there. You shall accept no ransom or atonement for the life of the murderer, who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. You shall accept no ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of thy priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that has been shed on it, except by the blood of the one who has shed it. So that's what the law says. David is required to carry out the law. And so here's Saul in his house, his sons, his grandsons, who I think the text would open up by it saying it is Saul and his bloody house. They are the ones responsible for this. They are the murderers. It's they who must pay for this crime. And they must pay for it by their lives. And so again, let's read what the Gibeonites say. It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul and his house. So we are not going to accept a ransom payment here. We're not going to accept a payment because that is against the law. I can't do that. And it's not for us to put to death any man in Israel. And so what they're saying here is they're not including Saul's house here, they're just including Israel. Now Israel is suffering for these sins, but they're eliminating, I'm not talking about people in Israel in general. And David knows by the word's difference, I'm not taking money from Saul's house, but then they don't say, I'm not taking a life from Saul's house. They say about all the people of Israel. I'm not holding them liable, but I am holding someone else liable. That's why he says here they are going to ask for something else. So David says, what do you say that I should do for you? He's the judge. He's the one that must carry it out. And they say, give us 7 of his sons, and we will hang them before the Lord, killing them, where? In Saul's own hometown, which is right next to theirs. And David agrees. So he sees the justice of this. So why would David agree to this? I can think of a couple reasons. One, and this is probably the most important, God is angry at Saul and his house for doing this. So it makes most sense, because they are killed for these sins, that these men participated in this crime willingly and wanted to do this. They wanted to annihilate the Gibeonites. It was an attempted genocide, and they were all partakers of it. Second, David knows, the Gibeonites know, we don't just pay off these murderers. We have to kill them even as they killed others. And it's interesting to note that there's only really one other place in the Bible that I could find where they have said, we want these men and we're going to hang them before the Lord. It's a public execution on a tree somehow. Even some translations use the word crucifixion here. It's a public penalty, and it's a shameful public death. And we will hang them before the Lord. There's only one other place in the Bible that I can find where there's a public death like this, and it uses the same term, to hang before the Lord. And it's during the days of Moses, and there's been a breach of the covenant. And the people of Israel start following a foreign god, Baal of Peor. And they do wicked things. And Moses says they must be killed. And he says, or God says to Moses, take the heads of the people, the chiefs of the people, and hang them in the sun before the Lord. There's that phrase. Hang them before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. So we have precedents now in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, that there are people who have broken a covenant, and the ones that are responsible are to be hung before the Lord so that they perish, so that fierce anger may turn away from Israel as a whole. Sounds very parallel to what's going on here. We have leaders of the house of Saul who need to be hung before the Lord for their murder, for breaking this covenant, so the anger may turn away from Israel. One other thing to note in the law, and you probably remember this verse. It says in Deuteronomy 21, if a man has committed a crime punishable by death and he is put to death, and you hang, it's a different word, but it's the same concept, hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain there all night, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed of God. Now this is going to come in later, but all that to say is in the law, for capital crimes of murder, it was appropriate to hang them. And we also see in the Old Testament that there was a breach of covenant and the leaders were hanged. So now let's go back. How does David then fix this problem? What does David do? So he says that David said, I will give them. So verse 7, but the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So why is he going to protect Mephibosheth? Because he won't break a covenant. The Gibeonites had a covenant broken against them. David's not going to break this covenant. So he's going to figure out how to hold to this and not break a covenant. That's going to come up. But the king took, verse 8, and the king took the two sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth. So there's two Mephibosheths here, which I suspect is one of the reasons why the author makes it so clear. He doesn't take this Mephibosheth, he does take this Mephibosheth. Because if he'd have just said he took Mephibosheth, you might be confused, and there might be some confusion as to which Mephibosheth is this? Yeah, I know they have different mothers, but were there two different mothers' names? Are they going by different names here? I don't know. Was it the same Mephibosheth? And it's utterly clear that it's not the same Mephibosheth. So the king took the two sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, so this would be the sister of Michal, who had been David's wife, whom she bore to Adriel, the daughter of Barzillai, the Maholothite, and he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord, and the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. So here's David. They asked for 7 men, and he chose these 7 men. Again, Why did he choose these 7? I suspect it's one, because it's to show he's an oath keeper. He keeps his oath that he made to Jonathan. He makes it very clear there's no mix-up between the 2 Mephibosheths. They're of different mothers. They're different descendants. And 3, we know that Mephibosheth is only 5 years old when Saul dies. Mephibosheth personally did not take part in any of these killings, which leads me to conclude that these other men, even though there's two sons and 2 grandsons, are older than Mephibosheth. And so these are men who had been part of this and were active enough to lead in the genocide. And so they are hung before the Lord. It is in accordance with the law, but the story isn't over. So what's the rest of the story? Go back to Deuteronomy, when it says, if anyone is hung before the Lord because of a crime, he's cursed of God, and what should happen? That night they should be taken down. That's the law. And for whatever reason, and we're not told why, they are not taught down. And we get this detail about Rizpah, who wants to protect them. And she's there for days, possibly much, much longer. And when David hears of it, he knows something didn't happen according to the law. And so what does he do? He doesn't go and tell Rizpah, out of here, they're dead. He doesn't go that route. He doesn't even go to the Gibeonites and say, why didn't you complete the job? He takes it upon himself, and he does 2 things, not just one. He doesn't just go and bury the bones of these men. What does he do? He also goes and digs up the bones of the buried Saul and Jonathan, and apparently his other sons. He digs them up. Why? And this is the key phrase. He dug up the bones of the men who had been hung by the Philistines. And then he takes the men who had been hung, and he takes these men who are now all together by virtue of their death and their hanging, all have been cursed by the Lord, and he takes them all and he buries them all in accordance with the law, linking the sins of Saul and his sons with the sins of these men, so that altogether it is seen that they participated in this genocide. They were all guilty of it, but now we are laying it all to rest. They have died for their crimes, and David makes sure that happens. So you see the phrase that is used, and it says here, David does this. David goes and gets these bones of Saul and Jonathan, and he commands that the bones of these other men, and they bury them. And verse 14, they did all as the king commanded. The king is in charge of this process. The king commands that this happens. And after that, after the death, after the burial, then God's response to the plea of the land. Okay. So the conclusion is David did what was right throughout this, and God responds to the plea of the land. The sin of attempted genocide, the breaking of the covenant, has been adequately dealt with. So how does this help prepare us for what a king ought to do? I'll make a couple connections to Jesus, because as I've tried to show, David is setting the precedence for what a righteous king ought to do. And even in his sin, like during the sin with David and Bathsheba, he is shown to be a representative whose actions impact everyone. So here is David who does something and God responds. So I'm taking this as a positive thing that David did. These men who ought to be killed for their sins, and David brings it about, and then he finishes it according to the law of Moses. It is significant here that David is the oath keeper. Even in the midst of people, his predecessors, breaking oaths, he is the oath keeper, and he's going to keep it according to the law. So that's what he's doing. But what's the bigger term is that he is the one who's making atonement. The king is the one who makes atonement. The king is the one who will reconcile a situation where there's people who have rebelled. It is now the king's problem that he will deal with. And that's what's going to happen when Jesus comes. He is going to be the one who is going to make atonement. Now, I'm going to make one more connection here, and it's the connection that is going to show how Jesus is going to do it so differently, and yet there's parallels. We know from what Paul says in the book of Galatians, that Jesus died on a tree because, why? Cursed is anyone who dies on a tree. So Jesus becomes the curse. He takes the place of the one who ought to die in the tree as a substitute, right? So Jesus bears the wrath of God as the substitute. It has bothered me for many years to think about Jesus dying such a brutal death by hanging on a cross, when so many of the sacrifices in the Old Testament seem to be a pretty simple death. You cut the lamb's throat and they die. It doesn't seem overly vindictive. It doesn't seem overly awful. It's just a simple death. Why did Jesus have to go through such utter punishment? And Paul made the link for us. Cursed is anyone who dies on a tree. One who dies on the tree is deserving of the death. And then God gave us two examples in the Old Testament during the days of Moses and one during the days of David, where men were rightly hanged for their crimes as oath breakers. And David brings about that atonement process. But when we get to Jesus now, we find that Jesus doesn't say, I must make atonement. These are the guilty ones. These are the oath breakers. He says, I will be the substitute. I will bear the penalty. I will be hung for them. It's right that they should be hung. It's right that they should die. And Jesus says, yes, and I will be the substitute. I will be the substitute. And so in Jesus, all sorts of things are coming together. He is the King. He is the one who will make atonement. He is the Lamb of God, and he will also be the substitute, all in accordance. That's why he came to fulfill the law. It is right that he be punished for this as our substitute. I think it's amazing to know that Jesus brings together all the things that you wondered, how in the world would they be brought together? But we have all these evidence of there are times for substitutes. There are times for ransom. There are times for atonement. There are times to bring the punishment to bear in its full weight. And Jesus does it all at once. So Lord, we come to you now saying we are amazed at what you did, that you bore the punishment. You made atonement not by rightfully slaying those those who are us by death, but took our place, so that the wrath of God might be turned away from us. Thank you for doing this for us. You are worthy to be the King and to rule and to receive all glory and honor and praise. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.